All right, welcome to our newest podcast in the Brewster Baseball Network. This is Dorks being Dorks. This is a BBA podcast where we're going to talk about out of the park and how it works inside the Brewster Baseball Association world. My name is Ron Collins. I'm the general manager of the Yellow Springs 9, and I have Stephen Lane, the general manager of the Long Beach Surfers with me. Welcome, Stephen. Thanks for being a part of this.
You're welcome, Ron. Thanks for having me.
Actually, I shouldn't say being a part of this. I think somewhere between you, myself, Matt, Aaron, and Ted at the time, I think kind of ginned this whole concept up. So we'll have to rope them into some of these as we go a little bit further in, because there will be much to talk about, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
I think we decided today we would start with the topic of free agency and contracts in general. An interesting time of the year for us here in the Brewster Baseball Association. We're kind of nearing the trade deadline, which is nearing the end of the season, which means that pretty much everyone, even us folks involved, hopefully knock on wood, in the playoffs, are starting to look at what's going to happen next year, assessing teams, free agency, trying to determine how much you can spend. I'm interested in your picture to start with on free agency. For me, this is kind of like the purpose of playing the game. I love free agency. It's the time period where your organizations twist and turn and build in all sorts of different directions.
Yeah, I don't know if it's the highlight for me, the way it sounds like for you, but it's certainly one of the most exciting times of the year. You really get to choose the direction of your franchise in a way that you don't get to choose as the regular season is going on.
Yeah. To me, the thing that makes me love free agency the most is about player evaluation and trying to decide who fits on your roster and how much to spend and so forth. I'm interested. Let me throw out kind of the first question to you as far as this goes. When you're looking at free agents and bidding and so forth, what are your thoughts on how you assess player overall value and how it fits into the Surfers roster, and how has that changed over the time period of your time in the league?
Yeah, I evaluate very much on a case by case basis, and I really look at what are my needs and do my best to not look at players who don't really fit a need that I currently have, because it's all too easy to get excited about a player who, you may really like, or who is, just in general a good player. But if there's not really a spot for that player on my roster, then I could get myself in trouble if I spend too much time daydreaming. So I focus in on what my team needs, and I try to look at a player who will fit that need, and, kind of take a look at, besides just meeting that need, are they popular? Can they play defense, and can they hit the ball? Mm-hmm. Do I have to look for a platoon partner for them? What do similar players at similar positions get paid? That's sort of the calculus that I do when I'm looking at adding a free agent.
Okay, so you take kind of a holistic point of view around where you're at, and it almost feels like you're trying to put together 4 or 5 different pieces of information and then just get kind of a gut feel for how this person looks like a surfer, right?
Yes, definitely.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
How do you decide how much to pay?
It's a combination of what I can afford and what I think they're worth based on their age, and based on, maybe what a couple other similar players are being paid. And for better or for worse, it also depends on what I think someone else might pay him, depending on his demand and how badly I need him.
Sure.
And that's something we might get into a little bit later that's unique to the BBA.
Yeah, I think let's jump into that, because one of the things that I think we'll talk about in this series is what's unique to the BBA, what's different. If most of us have played in multiple leagues, and we know that there's kind of a cultural difference and as well as a structural difference. And the BBA has some unique elements to it. Interested in your point of view around the salary cap in particular, because I think that salary cap creates a market dynamic that is a little bit different from a league that doesn't have a salary cap, right?
Right. The salary cap definitely contributes, in my opinion, to some of the more creative, if you will, contracts that we see across the league. And it is definitely something that if you're going to be a GM in the BBA, you have to be aware of the salary cap and your team's relative position to it at all times. Otherwise, you can really get yourself in trouble.
Both the salary cap and the budget, right? Because as we're talking about free agency in particular, I know when I was Yellow Springs and I came into the league back in 2025, I think was my first free agency. I came in 2024. In the last 3 games of 2024, where I went 2-1, or the last 4 games where I went 3-1, and I thought, hey, I've got a winning record. But my first free agency, we had a budget that was like $85 million or something like that to begin with. So the salary cap didn't make any difference to me, right? Because my owner wasn't going to let me spend up to the salary cap anyway.
Right. You've got to get your team in a position and your finances in a position where you can actually take advantage of the full salary cap and not have a restriction on your payroll that other teams don't have.
Yeah, we'll get into some of the financial things, how to manage that kind of process up, right? What do we do when we've got a low budget and how to get to a bigger budget? But I think that's a topic for another conversation. What I was thinking about that was relevant to my experience in building Yellow Springs, and you can actually find history of this on the forums, right? Because I was involved in the big Alfredo, the Savage bidding,
Alfredo
right?
Savage Salazar.
Yes, because I came in and Alfredo Salazar was the big, in that case, EBA free agent, but it's a similar kind of dynamic, right? I had an $85 million budget, but our payroll, due to some shenanigans going on before me, was down in the low 20s or something like that. So I had a lot of money for that first year. And so I was actually creating a contract that I guess maybe we can kind of shift into this. When is it good to give long-term contracts and different types of what I'll call bloatware contracts, right? Because the example I'm getting into here is with Alfredo Salazar. Chris Wilson and I, division mates, got into a very big bidding war, right? And that first year, we actually, I think Chris won the bidding war. I bid $52 million for the first year, right? But Chris bid 60 plus 4 years on, right? Those contracts for us actually made sense, even though our salary cap is 110 and my budget was 80 or 90. It made sense because I was not going to compete that year. And so I was deeply front loading a contract. And so there are some other guys that I've talked to that front load contracts. That's just the most obscene version of it, right? Fred Holmes and I talked on the GM's Corner about his propensity to front load contracts as much as he possibly can. And I think that's a characteristic of teams in a salary cap league that you won't see necessarily as much in a league that doesn't have a salary cap. What are your thoughts about that? When do you look at front loading a contract and when do you look at backloading it? How do you twist contracts in that sense?
Yeah, you definitely sometimes have to do it both ways. And I know if you are new to OOTP or new to the BBA, you may have in your mind from following Major League Baseball that it's very common to backload contracts. And there are times in OOTP and the BBA where you may want to backload a contract if there's a player that you need and you don't quite have the salary cap space or the budget space for the first year or two. But you're going to have something coming off the books, then you may have to backload to get that player. But I would say in more cases, it makes more sense to front load the contract, get the player sees the same value as he would if it were spread out more evenly, but then you've got that big chunk of salary and cap space out of the way in the first year, maybe the first 2 years, and then you have a lot more flexibility, a lot more ability to add other pieces a couple of years down the road. And like your case with Yellow Springs and with Madison, with where they were when Alfredo Salazar was signed, it just made sense in teams that weren't competitive in the first year or two of that contract, but to add a piece that could really be a part of the future.
So how do you think about, we've been talking about the kind of the huge front loading. Let's talk about what I'll term bad contracts, but really I'd just say long-term contracts. If you look at, I'm interested in your point of view. How would you compare, for those who were not in the league a few years back, Joshua Biddle? I get Justin and Joshua mixed up in my brain. Joshua Biddle came in with Atlantic City and made kind of a big splash, dropping a couple of $30 million contracts on a couple of big name pitchers in a gambit that kind of worked and kind of didn't. Compare that to the big contracts that Aaron in Rockville has taken on over the past year or two with was it Dan Cannon and Enrique Gomez, I think, is another big number. Those two are working out in slightly different ways. How would you talk about the difference between those two?
I would say that I'm a little more familiar with Rockville. I'm not sure exactly the state of the team that was surrounding Atlantic City when they signed those big pitchers, but I do know that Rockville had some significant prospect capital, both on the offensive side and on the defensive side. Arthur Dempster comes to mind right away, where you could really see that it was not just adding a couple of big contracts to a team that was just needing a couple of big contracts. It was adding those contracts to a team that was really on the rise and had some star potential in the prospects or in young players, where they were kind of complementary pieces instead of the big pieces. And then, the salary cap space was available because some of the other stars were on those minimum contracts.
Yeah, and I love your term prospect capital. I think that makes more sense. As I was jotting down some notes, I used some term about loss leaders, right? Which I didn't like even when I wrote it down. But prospect capital is a much stronger term for that. When you've got a solid baseline of young players under contract control, ideally even in their, just coming up in the first 2 or 3 years when they're at the minimum salary. And that is something that is fundamentally different about what Rockville did and what Atlantic City did. Atlantic City had a reasonable base of young players coming up, but they were not young players that were going to be impact guys. They were going to be young players who I love, right? Fillers and guys who can contribute. But Rockville has if you spend a little bit of time looking at Rockville's roster, you can see they still have guys at that minimum salary level who are putting up 2, 3, 4, 5 WAR a season. And so those big contracts that Aaron is bringing in are playing up against some young guys who are really strong contributors. And who knows what the future is going to bring, but a couple of those guys could end up being Hall of Famers before it's all said and done. The difference there, Joshua's gambit actually worked pretty well. He was in the play for Atlantic City was in the play for the playoffs, and so you have a hard time arguing against his approach. But it didn't have the long-term staying power that Aaron's has because his backdrop was not quite as strong. At least that's my point of view on it. So
right, yeah, and that certainly makes sense, and it's not necessarily bad to do it that way if you think you've got a window and you can add a couple of guys to help you break through during that window. If you don't mind paying the cost at the end of it, where you might really not have a good team, then that's perfectly fine. As they say, flags fly forever. So
there you go.
You've got it.
All right, let me play a little bit of the game here. I sent you a list earlier on of about 6 or 8 kind of big contracts, and what I'm thinking about is let's maybe walk down those contracts and describe what you think about those contracts, good contracts, bad contracts, what were the dynamics around them. What I basically did is I went through and I picked out contracts that are 6 years or on occasion 5 years that are active today, right? They were signed before this last season started. So let's just talk about the dynamics behind those contracts and see what we can learn from them. The Brewster Baseball Association is an out-of-the-park baseball league commissionered by Mr. America himself, Matt Rechtenwald, and competed in by an amazing group of outstanding general managers. Check us out at montybrewster.net. You have been listening to Dorks Being Dorks, a podcast where we put BBA GMs together to talk about Out of the Park and how it works in the BBA. Music is Some of My Fears by Daisy May and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Check out the rest of this discussion in Part B of this podcast on the forum, coming soon.
Just like the bucks are dead on the rain. The cross is twisted, the stars that will shine. The creation's threatening, the worry's mine. The king was singing, and now he's dead. John wanted peace, and it's war instead.